Is Chris Larson, and I'm a solutions analyst with Terra Information Group. And we are here today to discuss some of the potential pitfalls with integrations between benefit focus and third-party vendors. And let me just give you a bit of a background. I am a consultant with Terra Information Group. I used to work for Benefit Focus for about a year and a half as first an account manager for large employer groups, and then as an EDI specialist on a troubleshooting team to correct data errors and broken integrations. My current role, actually, I do have another job where I actually am a database administrator and data analyst for a CSR platform. So a lot of what I do is related to payroll or carrier or HR files on a daily basis. So some of the things that we're going to look at here, though, are specific to the benefit focus platform and the vendors or the third-party vendors that clients may have, such as a payroll vendor or any carrier files. And some of the things that you need to look for when entering into an agreement or a contract with Benefit Focus, and some things that you need to pay attention to or solutions to problems that you may end up having over the lifetime of the relationship. So the format is, what I'll do is I'll go through these slides one by one that I prepared just based on different topics. And what I'll do is after each slide, I think we can go ahead and open up the floor for a couple of questions related to that topic, and then close it again to move on to the next slide. So what I'll do then is move forward. And the first thing that we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about carrier EDI files. This would be any insurance carrier, any voluntary benefit, any type of vendor that you may receive or send a data transfer to. Obviously, this is going to be any medical vendor, any vision vendor, but there are a couple of different things that can happen based on the way configurations are. And of course, there are infinite variations and changes and customizations needed depending on clients and their business rules. However, most things can be accounted for. One of the biggest challenges in my experience with Benefit Focus and their carrier EDI files was the configuration of date rules in the platform. And to break this down to its simplest, it's simply a matter of, okay, what date does this client use to extend benefits to an employee? Meaning that if I worked for Terra Information Group today and my health plan is to end at the end of the month at which I leave, and I decide to terminate my employment tomorrow, the configuration of the benefit end date should be the end of the month, which means that it would be sent to my carriers, my insurance plans, as an end date of 4/30/2018. Unfortunately, there are a lot of different variations now to the platform. As you can see, there's been several upgrades. Obviously, this platform that they have is close to 20 years old now, and with the insurance industry and the HCM industry growing and several regulations being added and things always in flux, obviously there's going to be a lot of complex coding involved, and there have been a lot of different functionalities added to account for things that make it a little more difficult to keep track of how date rules can be configured. And even though it seems pretty straightforward, some of these other functionalities that have been introduced to the platform live in different areas, and things that can be configured one way in one area can overlap and not be set up correctly in another. And the worst part about that is trying to nail that down and figure out where it is, because you may not have the knowledge yourself of how the platform works, meaning that sometimes delivery can be a little lax, and you may not get the education that you need. So it's very difficult to reach out and get help from Benefit Focus without the actual terminology or where things live, which can make it extremely difficult. Some of these functionalities, though, that overlap and end up messing up the dates, and if anybody on this call has used Benefit Focus in the past, you've probably experienced something like this, but anytime that there's a qualified life event, meaning that somebody can make a plan change outside of their open enrollment, then that's actually a completely different place in the platform. And it's something that during implementation, it's something that you should almost sit down and have a 2 or 3 hour meeting with a configuration expert at Benefit Focus to make sure that the CRP, or the change reasons profile, has been set up absolutely correct, and also to make sure that it doesn't overlap with other system priorities. Another thing that really hurts people, especially with the dates rule, is the dependent age out. A lot of times, some employers may choose to extend benefits until the end of a year when a dependent turns 26. And unfortunately, because of some of the rules that are in the platform and because they supersede what's in place, it can cause problems with when a dependent's age out is terminated. And the worst part about that is that when these corrections are made, there are a lot of ripple effects that need to be communicated to the employer group or to the client. And sometimes, if it's not, that lack of education can lead to other ripple effects in the platform, such as things on your payroll deduction file that you weren't expecting. Now, rather than me continue to ramble about this topic, I can take a break for a second and open up the floor to any questions specifically to any kind of date rule issues you've ever had with Benefit Focus. Nope. No questions? No questions, or nobody?
Doesn't seem like we have any questions at this time.
All right, sounds good. We'll move on. Next thing I wanted to talk about then would be...
If anybody has any questions, please, you can either raise your hand, you can type in your question, or you can even unmute and, speak your question. Go ahead, Chris.
Okay, then what we'll do is, let's see, taking a look, moving on to the next one, configuration of plans. This is, again, this seems kind of finite. However, this is something that many groups can experience. Some of the bigger insurance companies, as I'm sure people on this call have experienced, you can obviously have standard integrations, or what you think is a standard integration. However, even though it's a standard integration between one large carrier, say a Blue Cross Blue Shield subsidy with Benefit Focus, the problem is that sometimes the plans are sold different to different carriers, and if things are bundled in a certain way or in a highly customized or unusual way, it won't work with the standard integration, or it's going to take a very tricky configuration of the way it's bundled. And again, not to get too far into details, but this is something that can be commonly misconstrued to clients and saying, hey, we have a standard integration, and then you find out later that, hey, we had this insurance plan that we thought was great. We purchased with our carrier for this year's plans, and we thought that as a partner Benefit Focus or an integration or somebody who has so many clients that you had a standard integration, and then you find out later that it's not. Well, the plan you chose is custom, and you are going to need to pay thousands of dollars for a change request in order for a custom or developmentally custom file. And it can kind of be maddening. So again, this is just another thing to look for, because sometimes it has been thrown out there that a CR is needed when in fact you can go back and configure the plans correctly at a different level. And it's something that unfortunately it's not well known in the configuration department at Benefit Focus, and it can end up resulting in lost funds or, people not understanding what's actually happening. Another big thing to pay attention to here, and you'll notice that one of the themes throughout this presentation is going to be that you're going to have two teams specifically working with Benefit Focus once you're live. Most companies will have a payroll team and a benefits team. And one thing that I have noticed in my experience is that those two teams aren't always working together, meaning they don't know what exactly what's going on in the other department, nor should they. However, when it comes to benefit focus, because of the way that things can be configured and because of the ripple effects that can come out into deduction files, it's almost imperative that the payroll and the benefits teams need to be included in almost every issue that has to do with the corrections to an employee's benefit, only because, especially with SAP integrations, as I'm sure many of you know, this is something that can result in retroactive deductions, meaning that when you have a correction made in the platform and it changes the effective date of, say, a medical plan, and the effective date should have been 6 months ago, and they're just correcting it because they just caught it, well, the benefits team will be happy to have this fixed, and the payroll team will be extremely upset when a 6-month retro deduction comes out unexpectedly from the employee's paycheck. And it's one thing that I have noticed is, even though it can be a giant pain, both benefits and payroll teams need to work in tandem a lot. Before opening up to questions, I'm going to go ahead and continue on just quick to, I'm going to look here at this next one and just kind of include this in what I was talking about. This is another thing that is, again, a kind of a ripple effect. If you have a COBRA vendor, say it's WageWorks, and you have a medical vendor in Aetna, and Aetna then needs a structure change mid-year. So, let's say that the company acquired through a situation here, let's say they acquired a small company and they're going to add a quick plan for 6 months until they can get everybody integrated into the new company or the bigger company. So what happens is maybe a quick COBRA configuration change is needed. Maybe a quick medical tweak is needed. And then what happens is that actually needs to be tested out with your COBRA vendor and your COBRA configurations as well, because what we were finding out many times with Benefit Focus is that, yes, that change is made and the medical vendor is fine, except that upon your next layoff of employees, all of a sudden you're finding out that there were 300 employees that didn't get COBRA notices and you're close to being out of compliance. So again, there are, pitfalls to be associated there too, because sometimes the foresight isn't there to think, well, hey, we need to make this change, but we also need to kind of think about all of the other changes that need to be made. And at that point, what I'll do is I will pause for a second and let any questions.
We have one comment or question, you could say, and it's we have a high deductible PPO with an HSA. We implemented 3 years ago, and it's still not happening, which requires manual processing.
And my guess is does that surround a lot of the configuration of the dates in the platform?
I guess.
Yeah.
So
I'm actually. Let me say I'm actually working on an issue that's identical to that right now for a current client of Benefit Focus, and one of the current projects that I'm assigned to is specifically the HSA problems that client's having. And one of the problems that they are having, because they have the same high deductible plan bundled with an HSA, is they have, I believe, 5 different pay calendars, which is pretty standard for large employer groups. So this isn't even something that we can say is highly customized. And so what happens is, as we're finding out, during open enrollment this year, all of their HSA logic is broken, and it had a lot to do with the fact that the payroll calendar or the deduction calendar was not configured correctly in OE, which again is something that should be sat down probably an hour or two with a configuration expert so that they can explain exactly the cutoff dates, the pay start date, the pay end date, and so that actually feeds into your SAP systems correctly when payroll deduction files are sent. Another thing that we're finding out is that sometimes some of the date logic that clients need don't exist on the standard integrations between Benefit Focus and SAP. So it's requiring a change request, or in the event of the person who's asking a question right now, manual effort, meaning that you've purchased a SaaS solution that you need to hire people to manage.
That's great, Chris.
But yeah.
Felicia, you have been unmuted, so if you have any further question regarding that point, you can make that now. Otherwise, I'll move on to your next question.
Hi, it's Felicia. So basically, with regards to the high deductible HSA plan, they advised that that there was a coding issue, that they didn't have the correct code to transmit over to the carrier to initiate that HSA. So just as of this year, they have the correct code. So hopefully that code will stop the manual process, but it's just been long and frustrating. Fortunately, we don't have too many people going over to the high deductible health plan, so it's manageable, but still we have to manage it, which isn't the best thing.
No, not at all. But, there are other things that you can push through. I'm assuming what you're talking about is a carrier file, then, not a payroll file?
It's a carrier file.
Okay, so when you're sending this to a carrier, when you're saying a code, I believe that is, and again, this is just from just the details that I'm getting from you now, I believe that's what I was referring to with the structure change, because what the structure is it assigns that code based on any algorithms that you have set up for your employees. And what that means is that, and I know that WageWorks is notorious for getting HSA and COBRA structure late, meaning that they can drag their feet. This isn't all benefit focus's fault all the time. So what happens here is that, when those are implemented, unfortunately, sometimes if they're done on the fly, they can be very tricky and it can be very quick. And then if it doesn't get tested and certain scenarios aren't there, unfortunately, you're left with an integration that is failing, meaning it's missing the correct codes to send to employees. However, that's something that is not, that shouldn't be an issue to the point where you are still doing manual effort. What you're describing to me right now is actually a very simple solution with the right person that can get fixed to make it so that it works perfect. Where it gets a little tricky is where the payroll files come in, and that's where I was referring to the change requests, which I realize I'm kind of jumping ahead of myself. But this is something. Yeah, those coding, the structure and the actual codes that you send on those files, those are actually very easily fixed. That's just something that it takes time and it takes testing, but it can be done in a day or two with the right person.
Okay. Well, I'm hopeful.
Okay.
We'll see.
Okay. Felicia, what we can do is perhaps we can even set up a time later on after the webinar where we can have this discussion further.
Okay. Sounds good. Thank you.
Great.
Yeah, and
Thank
also
you.
let me
Go ahead,
just say really quick, based on the things that I heard there, that again is a very solvable issue. I obviously I don't know all the details, but one thing that I have learned is that I'm going to say this with 99% surety, almost every carrier EDI file issue can be solved. The payroll issues are the ones where it gets murky and things can change, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But in my experience, and again, I was part of the troubleshooting team, unless it's a part of a global issue where the carrier's feed doesn't work at all and it needs to be completely redesigned, which again, that's happening to everybody and not just one client in this case, it's usually something that can get knocked out with a configuration tweak and some testing. So that's the only reason I say that. Of course, I could find out the details and find out that it's completely not what I think, so I don't want to lead you on. But yeah, it's usually pretty solvable.
Well, initially we were advised that our carrier, our group was sent over to the carrier in bulk amongst their other clients, and that the code couldn't go over because it was with these other clients. So
Who's the carrier?
Blue Shield, California. So since then, within the past month, they've abstracted our group. So now they're testing just our group with this HSA code. And if it works, then I'm just going to request that we go over as an independent and not bulked with their other clients, as they say that we are.
Is that a recent issue, or is that something that you've been experiencing for quite some time, like a year or two?
It's been a year or two. It's definitely been at least two.
Yeah, that's interesting because
Yeah.
I'm like I said, I'm with a client right now, and we are looking at an issue, and they did have something similar. Granted, this is a Blue Cross Blue Shield of Michigan file, which is a completely separate entity, and it's a vision file. But one of the cases that's been filed is what's called a break fix, meaning that the integration between the carrier and Benefit Focus was never set up correctly. And in this case, it's actually the carrier's fault. It's NASCO that provided all of the wrong structure and all of the wrong requirements based on what they need, which is just being uncovered. But again, that's rare, and that's going to take 60 days to complete. But that's kind of rare that happens, and it's a global issue. They're finding it out now that everybody who sends on the NASCO file in this vision format has to be fixed. And they own it, and Benefit Focus says this is a global issue that we'll go ahead and work with the carrier to make sure that these enrollments are taken care of. But again, that's rare.
Okay.
Okay. I'm just going to say that, we have a limited time for this presentation, so we're going to cut this question short now, and we will take this offline, Felicia. I'm going to move on to your next question. No? Okay. So let's continue on, Chris. And Felicia, we will connect with you offline after the presentation. Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, sorry, I talk a little bit. All right, so moving on, and I kind of alluded to this earlier. Another big problem that almost every single client has is that carriers are not very good. And the problem here is that Benefit Focus is truly the expert in this field, having built this industry pretty much and building carrier EDI files. But the problem is that the carriers haven't caught up. And unless it's a really large carrier, like Cigna's a really good one to work with. Blue Cross Blue Shield of South Carolina, because they were their first business partner. They're really good to work with. And there are a couple that really stood out that it was like, hey, great, I can't wait to work with this company because there are a lot of technical experts. They're big. They know what they're doing. On the other hand, there are a few that are notorious for very, very few technical people being available. And when they are, they have a really hard time understanding what the problem is. And in some of that cases, you can chalk it up to whatever the business of the carrier. But in the other side of that is that you got to realize is that these companies sometimes have to conform to what Benefit Focus needs. And so what they do is they think they're doing it right, and they're not, and they don't really have experts on hand. And it can be very difficult to fix files with carriers that don't know what they're doing. And that is one of the reasons that break fix is in place now that I'm talking about, because the carrier supplied the wrong information and everything had been tested out. And it now causes a big, giant issue for everybody that uses that feed. But, and the bad part about this for Benefit Focus is that all clients look at them and say, well, you let this happen. And unfortunately, they did everything right. It's just that the carrier didn't understand how to supply the information and didn't understand the questions that were asked and didn't have a technical person there. So one of the one of the big pitfalls you really need to look out for, and what you really should do with your account manager for every carrier that you send files to, is to really put it in their ear that you find out how technical they are and find out, do you have a good standby technical person that can jump in when we have 800 errors on a medical file and employees that are worrying about coverage? I'm going to go ahead and skip on. I don't really think that there's a whole lot of questions with that. I don't want to sit and talk about any bad carriers. I just wanted to mention that there are some really good ones too. So moving on, though, we'll move on to payroll files because we're about halfway through anyway. This is where some of the real issues can drag on, and it can be difficult. One of the things that we really see with payroll files is, again, the date rules. And I'm sure if any of you use SAP, you see this because of the fact that there are different date configurations. And what will happen is sometimes these rate configurations are not set up with the benefit configurations, or they mirror them even though the dates should not. And it becomes a very difficult, complex project to configure the date rules in tandem with the way that carrier EDI files need to be set up and the way that payroll files need to be set up. And unfortunately, rate effective date configuration lives in a completely different area of the platform. And again, this has to do with functionality that was added as Benefit Focus grew. But if you have a payroll file, more than likely you are also sending an inbound, or I'm sorry, I guess it would be outbound from a client's perspective, a demographic file that loads in each morning or whatever cadence you send it. And rate effective dates have to be based on your demographic file, based on when people may be terminated or may increase a salary that changes the level of a voluntary benefit or something similar. So again, it can be very tricky to set up, and trying to make it work needs a lot of thorough testing to make sure that, hey, we have these rights, and we need to make sure that not only are rate effective dates being sent correctly on the deduction file based on what we need to see, but we're also getting them when there are specific changes based on an employee logging in with a QLE or any other different change outside of a demographic file. Again, this is extremely tricky, and I'm sure that if you've had Benefit Focus for over a year, that you've probably experienced something like this with your deduction file. So I don't really know if I can go too much into detail on this one, just because there are so many things to talk about. So I guess I can open up for specific questions at this point. All right. Doesn't sound like there are any. So we'll move along quick to the next one. And this goes back to talking more on the HSA. And I think that I may have mentioned some of this already from what I was going to talk about. But again, the HSA can be a problem with both carrier files and payroll files because of the pay calendars and because of the tricky nature that this works in. Another problem here is that, and this is where a lot of the rub comes in, and it makes it difficult for not only Benefit Focus, but for carriers and clients. Benefit Focus's platform is built upon the premise of a plan year. And that plan year is obviously your plan year for your insurance benefits, when you're going to do open enrollment, and so on and so forth. The one benefit that is not congruent with that type of setup is HSA, because it's ongoing and because there are contributions that are left and so on and so forth, and the account can close and it can be added to at any time. It's a nightmare. It's a nightmare for all parties. And the problem with that is that when this gets configured, you have to be very, very vigilant about when these cutoff dates are. And if you have multiple calendars, it needs to be tested out. And unfortunately, and this is just, you can't even really fault this for Benefit Focus. It's just more of a timing. I have, in my experience, dealt with clients that had, say, 7 or 8 different pay calendars. And that included people that were paid biweekly, twice a month, monthly, weekly, and it, was tricky. The reason it was tricky, and the reason that there is a hole, or what I'm trying to say, and you can't fault Benefit Focus, is that if you get into this situation, you're also going to have to probably put in customized pop-ups for employees in certain groups, depending on when changes are made, because an employee, just based on the way that the pay setup has to be, based on the multiple pay calendars, an employee may make an election today that they may not see for 45 days, depending on the pay cycle group they're in. And if it's not communicated, again, that's a problem that many employers deal with, hearing from employees saying, wait a minute, I made this change last month. It doesn't go into effect until next month now? I don't understand. And again, it can be a very big problem setting up and configuring this. There are, again, a myriad of problems that I've dealt with HSA, especially when it relates to the deduction files and SAP-specific integration. So rather than talking about each one, I'd rather, if anybody has any questions, anything specifically that they'd want answered or any insight about, I'm willing to listen. All right. Well, I am going to assume everybody can still hear me and that we don't have questions. So I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next slide here. And I did kind of refer to this with everybody as well. This is huge, especially this second point here. Any corrections that are made, and there are going to be corrections made at some point. There's going to be human error. There's going to be a bug in the platform. There's going to be something that happens where a value is incorrect. Whether it's the group's fault, whether it's Benefit Focus's fault, whether it's the employee who logged in made a mistake's fault, whatever it is, a correction is going to have to be made. And one of the things that it's up to a group to be vigilant about is to make sure that you are watching these changes come out in every file and prepared for them. And that seems to be a big shortcoming where, again, the benefits team realizes that, say, 800 people got the wrong effective date. They were supposed to get a new effective date because they had a rate factor survey or a tobacco survey. So what happens is we found out, oh, it's configured wrong. This was something that was actually set up incorrectly by the group, and they've asked Benefit Focus to change it. The head benefits administrator recognized it, communicated it, was extremely happy when it was fixed. And the next Monday when the deduction file came, it was a nightmare because the payroll team was extremely unhappy based on the fact that there were 800 people that were going to be getting retro deductions that week that was automatically loaded into their payroll system. And they were forced with a 4-day window to communicate to these people that, hey, guess what? You owe us this much for insurance because we've been billing you wrong and it's coming out this Friday. So again, coordinating between your benefits team and your payroll team is a key strategy session if you want to keep things working in harmony, and it's something that you should adopt from the beginning. Any questions or any concerns? All right, well, moving right along. One of the big things, and this is going to relate to both carrier and payroll files, is going to be the error reports and the exception reports that you get from Benefit Focus. And I'm sure that every single person on this call has had experience with an exception report or an error report because data makes the world go round, and it didn't even have to be with Benefit Focus. I'm sure you've seen one of these. Making the platform work is based 100% or dependent upon 100% that these are checked and corrected and monitored consistently. And one of the things that can happen is when you have a company that is purchasing their first HR software solution that don't have the experience, they don't get the education, and what you find out is there are a lot of clients that are unaware that this is a problem and that they are responsible for at least monitoring it and looking at it and making sure that things aren't happening. Otherwise, things won't work right. And one of the key things that I have always talked to clients about, and one of the services that I've also helped provide, is to sit down and discuss with them through a couple of iterations of each what's happening. In other words, let me walk you through the behavior. Let me show you in the history of changes on somebody's history on their record in Benefit Focus where the timing is and where you can expect to see these on files and why you saw this. And this is what the carrier is asking for here, and this is what Benefit Focus needs here. I don't know if anybody on this call has any experience with reading an exception report or an error report from CVS Caremark, but it's kind of like reading hieroglyphics. And it's something that took me a couple months to learn as the subject matter expert at Benefit Focus. So I can completely understand a head benefits administrator who opens it and throws his or her hands up and says, I don't have time for this. But again, it's a key to making sure that the software that you're paying for is working correctly. The next point that I kind of want to make there is that, knowing your data, knowing the timing, and knowing your contacts. Another huge thing is setting up the timing of all of your files to make sure that things are working correctly based on the volume of when you expect changes from employees. I know that seems pretty basic, but a lot of people don't realize it until after the fact. And they also, a little known thing is that you can change the timing of your files at Benefit Focus as long as you file a case and plead your business reason for it. Even when they say no the first time, you can make it happen. Another thing is, and even if you can't do it from the beginning, setting an expectation with your carriers and with Benefit Focus that you know what you're doing and that you check your error reports and that you expect to see them by a certain time and you expect to have an answer on errors is key. And the reason that I say that is because sometimes the squeaky wheel gets the grease, meaning that, open enrollment leaves a lot of teams, not just Benefit Focus, short-staffed and people scrambling for resources. And, if somebody's not complaining about it, sometimes it's not worth doing because I have so much on my plate right now that I wouldn't be able to get to it even if I tried. So that's one thing that you need to pay attention to and watch for, because if you set that expectation with your carriers and Benefit Focus and let them know that you know what you're talking about and what your expectations are, you have automatically become the squeaky wheel forever. And they look at you as somebody that knows what they're doing, and they will be on point. And I hate to say it, but, that's unfortunately how business works in most places where resources can get low. So, again, setting that expectation and letting them know that you mean business and you know what you're doing, it goes a long way. And, again, that comes with some education of how they work and knowing your own data. So if there's any questions, now would be a decent time. All right. No questions. We'll go ahead and move on.
Of course, we do have a few questions, but in the interest of time, I think we have a question from Sandra Mayfield. She's saying, I wasn't aware that Benefit Focus provides error and exception reports.
Oh, goodness.
And then,
well, that's going to make for a very interesting conversation with your customer success manager. Now, let me say this real quick. For carrier EDI files, if Benefit Focus is sending a file to your carrier is the one who supplies the EDI file or the error report. But if you have a demographic file that loads into Benefit Focus each morning, they supply you with an error report. And a lot of clients don't know that either, that you have to go in and check that report on your own because nothing is sent to you. But if you're unaware, go ahead.
We also have another question from Felicia Williams. She's saying, is it typical for a client to not to be able to see their carrier EDI reports to see what's going over to the carriers?
Yeah, it is common, and I know that seems like it would be simple logic and it should just be as easy as talking and getting it set up, but unfortunately, and I'll give you just one example. You have a large carrier and business partner like WageWorks who does not send out error reports, which is actually extremely smart because of PII and PHI. So what they do is they require vendors and clients to log in to their own website to retrieve the report. And Benefit Focus doesn't do that. And unless the client knows about it, that doesn't happen. And Benefit Focus doesn't have an automated way to log in to a third-party server and retrieve those in mass. And they definitely don't have the resources. It's not built into the cost for them to have to go in and log in to get each error report. And it's something that the client definitely should be owning to go and grab those error reports. And unless you're told that, how would you know? Most clients find out without being data savvy right away, meaning you haven't had another solution that you've been with for 5 years and you're making a switch. The ones that aren't savvy usually find out 6 months to a year in, and they find out from their carrier account manager who says, hey, this isn't working. Did Benefit Focus ever check these error reports that we send them? And that's usually another fun conversation for your customer success manager.
And we also have another question from Felicia. She's saying that we don't get error or exception reports. Is this something that must be requested? I think I already read that one, right?
I think so.
Okay. Okay. And I think there's another question from Felicia. I think you might have already addressed this. She says, our COBRA EDI file suddenly stopped migrating dental information in January of this year. The only change was a change in the dental carrier. They don't anticipate a fix until late April. Another manual process to ask for dental to be offered to stay in compliance.
Well, again, without knowing too many of the details, it's going to depend on what happened. But if it's something that Benefit Focus missed, any manual process should be owned by them, meaning that if they missed a configuration during open enrollment, which is always comes out in the wash in January, then that's something that they need to own and take care of. However, it sounds to me, if it's going to be that long of a fix, that it was something developmentally, and that means an engineer has to fix it, which again means it's a bug in the platform and they should be owning. So again, without knowing all of the details, it sounds to me like you should probably go back to them and say, listen, what happened here? Is this our fault? Why are we having to do a manual process when we already pay you to manage our stuff?
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, there are a lot of times where they should probably come forward and own stuff, and you have to push them. But if you push them and present it, especially to the person who's working your case, and it gets to a higher up, when you start throwing words around like non-compliance and, hey, we're a paying customer, you'll see that you get what you want. Any others?
I think that was it, Chris. We can move on to the next remaining conversation.
All right. Well, the next, I don't have a whole lot more here. This kind of goes into more of what I was talking about, but this also talks about the payroll, the deduction and demographic file error reports. And when I say knowing and understanding the timing and the lingo and the behavior, a lot of times you'll see that there are changes that are made and you freak out thinking, oh my gosh, I got to fix that. And you go in and fix it. And the very next day it's back. And without understanding where the system of record is and how the behavior of those files work, sometimes you're just, making changes that are going to be erased like an Etch-a-Sketch the next day because you need to fix it in a different place. And again, this may seem basic to some of you, but to those of you that don't have the experience with a data-enabled vendor, this can be very challenging at first, and it can be almost overwhelming. So I don't know. I find that, a lot of times it turns out to be a lack of knowledge, and that's going to be another one of my points here in a second. So let me just go on forward, because if there are any questions, they'll probably relate a little bit to this too. Some of the other items that I wanted to talk about, we'll get to that in a second, but one of the big things that you have at your disposal with Benefit Focus is they do have a pretty amazing online repository of tutorials. And these tutorials show you some pretty specific things in the platform that probably even your CSM doesn't know. A big one that I just learned with my current client, and to me this is one of the most basic things that should be taught during delivery, is looking at a history of changes and understanding that the little green check mark is the actual approval that triggers it to an EDI file. And that's the only reason that that little green check mark even exists on the history of changes. And a lot of people don't know that. Clients don't know that. And that's key to reading the history of changes, because you can see that something was approved, but unless you see the little green check mark, that was never triggered to an EDI file. And I know that there are at least 2 or 3 of you right now that didn't know that, and you're logging in right now to look at the history of changes, say, what's he talking about? Little green check mark. But it's there, and trust me, ask somebody at Benefit Focus the next time you're on a call, say, hey, what's this little green check mark on the history of changes, and see the answer you get, because that's key to how the process works, and you'd be shocked at how many clients aren't told that. So pushing your CSM for tutorials on specific things, or even telling him that, hey, the Benefit Focus University is so big, I don't have time to troll through there because I actually, am a benefits manager and I hired this I hired your company to make my job easier. So why don't you take a look through there with these things that I need and point out 5 or 6 tutorials that would really benefit me? How about that, CSM? And again, these kind of things push you toward using the product to the way it was. And you'll see that sometimes things that are happening can actually be your own fault, only plausible deniability because you didn't know and nobody taught you. So again, that's a key point, is to push for any of the resources available so that you learn. Learning the platform is probably the biggest key to making it work and finding out any shortcomings. Another thing that you want to look for, and this is just really quick, I don't know if anybody has ever had a decline plan, meaning that, say, if employees decline medical, you'll give them $50 a paycheck. This is fantastic. However, one of the huge ripple effects is that when you configure the absence of a plan as a real plan in Benefit Focus, that's just true or false, 1 or 0 as far as the ACA is concerned. In the first year of ACA implementation, every client that had a declined medical plan and an employee elected it was then covered under the ACA for medical, even though they had elected not to and took a subsidy from the employer for not getting it. This is not a rare occurrence. This is probably 1 in 10 clients, and it's something that they are accounting for now. However, it is something that does come out in ripple effects in other places. So again, this is just a rare tidbit, but if you ever have that inkling to have a decline plan, tell Benefit Focus to figure out a solution other than actually configuring it as an actual plan, because it can mess up a lot of things. One of the other big things that's really key, Felicia mentioned in one of her questions that she said she noticed something went wrong in January and that they were fixing it and it might take a while. Everybody is busy during open enrollment planning. Starting it early, like if you're a 1/1 renewal and your open enrollment is going to be the middle of November, your carrier changes, your planning, your testing, you should be pushing Benefit Focus yesterday. And you should not let them gloss over details, and you should ask for meetings about specific things that you don't understand. And one of my favorite things when I go into a room and don't know what's going on, which can happen many times, trying to figure out what I'm going to fix, is to look at them directly in the eyes and say, hey, explain it to me like I'm a 2-year-old. I don't know what I'm doing, and it's your job to make me know what I'm doing. And, when they come at you with, hey, we want you to fill out this CRP. Okay, tell me why. Tell me what this is. Tell me where this lives. Tell me what I'm doing here, and tell me all of the things that can happen, and give me a guide. Don't just tell me to do it and send it back to you without expecting a few questions or a sit down. And they'll tell you, well, we don't have time. It's not a big deal. But you know what? You're the paying customer. You have that time, and you can push them for it. And the more you plan and the more you get that stuff out of the way now, the smoother experience you'll have, and you'll experience less things in January when the real EDI issues come out from OE issues. And then again, key point, make sure that any planning done open enrollment is done with both your payroll and benefits team in the room at all times. And that pretty much wraps it up. I sped through the last couple just because they're all kind of lumped together and we only have a few minutes left, but I think what we can do now is open up the floor for any questions on any items that we talked about, or if anybody has thought of anything since.
I think we have one more question from Felicia. Felicia, I've also unmuted you if you want to speak and relay your question yourself. Felicia says, is it reasonable during open enrollment to have a test and retest new rates and carriers from the client perspective? Do you think benefit focus test prior to rolling out to the client?
Wow, that's a loaded question. Yes, I do think they test. Do I think it's adequate sometimes? Probably not. But I do believe they do their best to try to test. I do know that, again, resources can leave them limited, and I believe that some things aren't tested as thoroughly as they should, and a lot of things get missed. I think the testing could be better, but yes, they do have a testing department.
Okay, thank you. We just need a confirmation of that because we often ask whether one exists.
Well, and you know what's really funny about this, and this is where again it makes them look bad when they're really not. That change that I referred to earlier that I'm working on with this current client, that's something that was not only supplied wrong by the carrier, but was also tested, including that same scenario at least 3 different times in all the notes we read, and the carrier just missed it. And Benefit Focus built this wrong to the wrong standards. So now that it's broken and everybody's upset, of course it's Benefit Focus's fault. And the first question out of my current client's mouth was, did they even bother to test this? And, once we uncovered and got all the details, yeah, they sure did. And it wasn't Benefit Focus at all. However, having been on the inside and having fixed a lot of broken integrations and realizing that it should have been caught during testing, it could be better. Anybody else?
If we don't have any other questions, then we can conclude the webinar, and our team will follow up with you individually, and we can also arrange individual sessions with you to answer any of your specific questions that we might not have answered on this webinar. We'll be sending out the recording for the webinar and also our contact information if you need anything. Thank you.
And thank you everybody for coming.